Hello, everyone. My name is Clinton Johnson. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm one of the founders and leaders of the North Star of GIS. I'm also a member of Blacks United in Leading Technology Forward, or BUILT, and I lead BUILT's Philadelphia chapter. I am so excited to have all of you with us today as we continue a month-long discussion series on mapping Black health and wellness. Today's event will allow us to share a few examples of how GIS is being used to preserve Black history, and what it feels like to do that work. Before I get too far ahead of myself, I want to take a little bit of time to talk a little bit about the North Star of GIS, a 501c3 organization that strives for a more racially just world through a more racially just GIS. Since 2017, we've delivered engaging events and workshops for over 2,000 guests, showcasing dozens of Black students and professionals sharing innovative business and social impact solutions. Essentially, we're here to help leaders, educators, and everyday people advance intersectional anti-racism and increase belonging for Black people and other marginalized groups. Our programming includes the North Star Bridge, a program that connects Black students at HBCUs with opportunities in GIS. North Star Guides, a library of content and services that helps individuals and organizations lead the way to racial justice and belonging through a GIS lens. The North Star Telescope, a new program launching soon that will work to magnify Black stars in GIS from college to the C-suite. And the program that's delivering this event and so many more, North Star Events, our platform for showcasing Black GIS talent as well as showcasing tech for intersectional racial justice. Our Mapping Black Health and Wellness series includes a few sessions. An opening discussion that began our conversation about mapping Black health and wellness. Today's conversation, Historic Black Communities, Preserving and Caring, to share a few examples of how GIS is being used to preserve Black history, and again, to discuss what it really means and what it really feels like to do that work. A spotlight on mapping justice, a course developed initially through MOSTech, a part of MIT's Office of Engineering Outreach Programs. Our Black History Month event series also serves as a rallying cry for our partners, so be on the lookout for more sessions from Unity and Power at Here Technologies and some other events being developed later on in this month. But again, you all are here for today's event, Historic Black Communities, Preserving and Caring. In addition to myself, today's conversation features speakers from the Texas Freedom Colonies Project, Ken Kofa, and the Oklahoma Historical Societies. And I'll let our speakers tell you more about themselves and their great organizations and efforts shortly. But before we open those conversations, I want to make sure that we address one question that many of you may be considering. What do we mean by mapping Black health and wellness? So, for starters, the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, which was established in 1915 and was instrumental in bringing Black History Week and later Black History Month into reality, well, that organization has set the theme for annual Black History conversations since 1928. And this year's theme acknowledges the legacy of Black scholars, Black medical practitioners, and Black folks using other ways of knowing. A few examples being birth workers, doulas, midwives, naturopaths, herbalists, and so on. The theme considers activities, rituals, and initiatives that Black communities have done to be well across the entire diaspora. And what does that have to do with mapping and why does it matter? Well, the Center for Disease Control and Prevention has acknowledged that health equity considerations for racial groups include the unfortunate reality of discrimination in systems meant to protect well-being and health. The reality that people from some minoritized racial and ethnic groups face multiple barriers to accessing healthcare. The impact of people from minoritized racial and ethnic groups often working in essential worker settings such as healthcare facilities, farms, factories, grocery stores, and public transportation. Socioeconomic inequities, which cause people from some minoritized racial and ethnic groups to have less access to high quality education. And the reality that racial inequities have led to a higher percentage of people from minoritized racial groups and ethnic groups living in overcrowded housing. And more individuals and organizations are working to use maps to understand and take action to address these issues. Territorial Empathy in New York used maps, analysis, and storytelling to raise awareness of racial disparities impacting Black, African American, and Latin American communities in New York. Individuals working in and outside of organizations are studying and taking action to address a wide range of racial disparities in health and wellness. And unfortunately, these conversations and actions are not always at the center of the work to increase positive health outcomes. North Star of GIS seeks to elevate conversations about the representation of Black people in particular, but other minoritized racial groups as well. We seek to elevate discussions and action to make racial equity central to the work of GIS and geography. And by Black representation, we mean people of the Black or African diaspora from a broad range of communities and geographies, and of a wide range of social identities and social characteristics, including a wide range of races, ethnicities, indigeneity, gender identities, transgender identities, sexual orientation, age, and socioeconomic backgrounds and experiences. And we seek racial equity at the intersection of all systems of oppression, including sexism, heterosexism, ageism, ableism, and more. So when we say we seek a more racially just world through a more racially just GIS, we mean a global GIS industry and community that reflects the full richness of Black communities and experiences worldwide. And we mean a global GIS industry and community of practice that embraces intersectional racial equity as a primary motivator and criteria for mapping, for analysis, and for geospatial enablement. And now let's get started. Really excited that you all joined us today, and I'm really excited to introduce some of our speakers. We're gonna begin with the folks from Kenkofa. Demisha Rutherford and Jordan Brunson, the founders of Kenkofa, can you join us to the stage, please? How are you all doing today?
Good.
Wonderful. How are you?
I'm doing well. I'm doing well. I want you to take a few minutes to explain to the audience here a bit about yourselves, personally, professionally, and take some time to go over, one of your projects.
All right, so I'll do the short introduction. So Jordan and I are founders of Kenkofa, as Clinton mentioned. We actually met last year on Clubhouse, kind of just doing our own thing, and just so happened to end up in a set of conversations that are around African American genealogy. And later, through a bunch of conversations and piloting a genetic database, realized that we were cousins and started a community around this. That has led us to build on some of the knowledge that we have in working in tech and operating at startups, to actually build a genetic and genealogy platform that is making it easier for Black folks to uncover our family history. If you could advance to the next slide. Okay, so we are focused on cultivating and preserving Black communities, IRL, which is in real life, and via URL, so both virtually as well. We have a virtual genealogy club, which is meant to provide a safe space for Black folks to be in community as we uncover our research journey, our family history. The next one we have is community research projects. So that might be a community here in Dallas called the 10th Street Freedmen's District. And they are facing, which we'll get into a little bit later, are facing issues of gentrification and just urban renewal and issues with preservation and other things. And then our most favorite project right now we have going on is what we call the African Diaspora Reunification Project. And it's a genetic database where we are exploring our shared connections to each other. And we have almost close to 1,000 folks in there who are looking to reconnect to each other by using DNA and, historical records and just conversations and getting back together that way. And I'll let Jordan tell you a little bit more about our Black Cemeteries app.
Hey, everyone. So as you can see here, and as Misha mentioned, one of the core tenets of Kenkofa and the community that we've built is within community research and community collaboration. The Black Cemeteries app started as a result of one, collaboration, but two, some of the community-led research efforts between myself and a few cousins. We had these huge collections of records, death records, obituaries, as well as index photos of cemeteries that we had been visiting and documenting, because what we realized is, in order to find more about our direct ancestral lines, we had to learn more about the communities in which they lived and the interconnectedness of families within the same community. So we realized that we needed to, one, collaborate with one another to better understand some of these relationships, but also we realized the importance of documenting these burial grounds, which hold a lot of answers that we were seeking, and the need to research an entire community. So this app is meant to accomplish a few things. One is to preserve the endangered and often neglected or forgotten burial grounds of our Black ancestors, and to bring attention and more resource to those burial grounds. So to assist those who are leading the cause of as caretakers, as preservationists, as researchers, and as loved ones, but also to bring collaboration to those who are researching or curious to uncover their stories in the same way that my cousins and I have been trying to uncover our family history. So we're excited to bring forth this app, which is kind of the first of its kind for genealogical purposes, where we'll be able to enable communities, researchers, institutions, and others to come together in a shared space to preserve our precious history.
So, because it is almost Mardi Gras and thinking of care and communities and just making sure we pay homage to one specific case in history, I will talk about Social Aid and Pleasure Clubs of New Orleans. And so these are organizations that have been going on in some ways before emancipation and right after. They have their roots in traditional African spirituality and, I would say, community organizing and ecosystem building. And so basically people get together, decide to pool resources to make sure that they can bury their loved ones in dignity. And you might see them do the second line parades. And they also do things like held back to school drives. And if there was ever like a natural disaster, they might be the first responders in terms of making sure their community has what they need to survive. So we'll get more into types of care as we continue the conversation, but thank you.
Thanks, you two. I have to say that I was, of course, going to bump into Kenkofa at some point because I'm on that sort of family genealogy committee for one big branch of my family, and we have a lot of avid researchers. I don't know the degree to which people understand really like how significant some of the losses are in Black communities, especially those who are African descendants of slaves in the Americas and the Caribbean. So just having more and more resources to help connect us around the more specific kinds of challenges that we face within the greater context of genealogy is a really valuable thing. So I really want to say thanks for that, for bringing that into life. Now I want to transition to Marcus Young, a GIS specialist from the Oklahoma Historical Society. Marcus, let's welcome you to the stage. Hey, Marcus, can you tell our audience here a bit about yourself and a bit about the project that you worked on and why it was important for you to do that?
Oh, yes. Thank you for the question. Thanks. I'm happy to be a part of this platform and these other professionals. But as Clinton said, my name is Marcus Young. I'm a GIS specialist at the Oklahoma Historical Society. I am a husband and father, just avid, just historical Black history, just buff. I'm interested in it. This project that you see right here in front of you is the project I did, All Black Towns. It was a very interesting and just deep dive learning project for me. Even though I'm here from Oklahoma, I learned some interesting things. The subheading that you see there is remembering safe havens. So some of these towns in Oklahoma, well, really to kind of start out, there was upwards of 50. Even through research, at one point, Oklahoma was almost going to be deemed a black state. Even though that didn't fully fall through, some of those founders who founded certain institutions like Langston University in Langston, Oklahoma, uh, some of that foresight still stood. Right now, there are 13 all black towns left. Some more a little bit more active than others in regards to like Facebooks or any kind of activities. Uh, um, Growing projects or any kind of festivals. I have an interactive map that was also embedded within the story map that you see there. The blue squares are the towns no longer inhibited. The stars are the actual towns that are still active. Like one you see right there is Boley, Oklahoma. Learned some interesting facts. One of these towns had ties to the Negro Baseball Leagues, that was Clearview, Oklahoma. Boley that you see there, that was the largest of the all black towns and definitely probably the most prominent. If we could go to the next slide, please. Also have some audio within the story map, specifically a poem that was read to recruit, if you will, and garner former freedmen to Oklahoma as a safe haven state where, hey, you won't have to necessarily look behind your back, in fear of, our oppressors, white racism. These towns, some of them bolstered grocery stores, banks, um, lumber yards. You name it. Medical professionals. Right there in the bottom right corner is some council members, I believe, or either bank members at the Old Farmers Merchant Bank in Boley. It had an attempted robbery from one of Pretty Boy Floyd's gang members. To the left there is Booker T. Washington. He deemed it one of the most. Sorry, excuse me. He deemed it one of the most inspiring of Negro towns and most interesting. And if we could go to the next slide, please. But yes, what we do at the Oklahoma Historical Society, and we'll possibly, as my previous members had said before, we'll talk about CARE, but we work in preserving historical sites, communities. To give you all a little context, within our state of Oklahoma, we are housed under the National Register, which is the National Park Service. Um, we have 1,300, a little over 1,300 sites and districts that are deemed eligible either through events, history, architecture, things of that sort. Only about a little over 30 of them are of our ethnic heritage black. So we're looking at like what that's maybe just a little over 2%. I take pride and am humbled by the work that I do. I know I'm not the be all end all, but as I said, it's just a certain level of care and interest that I put within this work that I do.
Thanks so much, Marcus. I also learned a lot, when I learned about your project, and I think it was one of the first projects of this kind where folks are preserving Black history by highlighting some of these all Black towns, all Black communities, all Black neighborhoods, historically Black areas, and there are so many of these spaces around the country. So we really appreciate you bringing this project into existence, and we try to find all the opportunities we can to introduce other people who are trying to do the same thing to your work and to the work of the other speakers here. For instance, our next speaker, Dr. Roberts, has a really exciting project to talk to you all about. So I want to bring Dr. Roberts to the stage and give her an opportunity to share more about her work, her project, and I'm sure you all will be excited to hear about it.
Thanks so much for making me a part of the event and having an opportunity to talk about the Texas Freedom Colonies Project and the greater project, which is bringing visibility to historic African American places within planning and historic preservation planning processes. So what you see before you is actually one of our most public-facing projects as the Texas Freedom Colonies Project, which is our atlas and study. But this project, I think, is important to understand, is not one that's just about its digital presence, but one that originated in 2014 as a project whose genesis was really within two things. My own personal experience of losing relatives and losing people whose history I had not known, and only beginning to learn of that, late into my adulthood. And it caused me to change my career from working in government to actually returning to the academy to study historic African American settlements full time. And the other is simply seeing as a professional the destruction of these places and hearing from descendant communities how much they felt not only invisible culturally, but they felt invisible in terms of historic preservation and in terms of actual urban planning processes or regional and rural planning processes. And so my interest in developing the Atlas is primarily about how do we make an online space that is both a place to identify, hold information about settlements which have no other place in which you could actually see them. That is, these are places that are often have unstable titles, so you can't go down to the courthouse and see evidence of them. They may have never been on Department of Transportation maps. They may have never even showed up on soil survey maps. They may have been in no way documented, except in the memories of our elders. And so what we do through the project, through this platform, is we centralize all the data that we collect through our three-part engagement model. We are a critical, engaged research project and completely collaborative. We are based in the university, and all of my team are students, but we are committed to connect, collect, and co-create. We collect data and information in the form of stories and interviews, and invite people to do that both online and in person. And what you see here is a dashboard that shows the status of that endeavor, which is that we've located 423 of the original list of 557 settlements in Texas. And there are 213 public pieces of information that have been contributed to that cause. And there's 85 for which we need to get more information or verify that they're associated with Black places. And then the final number is simply showing the number that we still need to locate physically. So this is giving you an idea of the type of information that people share. And they upload images, so funeral programs, photographs, documents, cemetery maps, all types of information to substantiate that these places once existed or has a current demographic or group of stakeholders that prove up that they once existed. So it's both a visual library as well as a depository of information. How do people deposit information? We train them how to survey and interview each other at Train the Trainer workshops. But for those who are anywhere in the world, they can come to the Texas Freedom Colonies Project Storyteller portal, and here they can enter into the survey information about their settlement, the approximate location or size. They can put a point on the map. They can enter information about current preservation activities, needs. It's really also an assessment of the present and not just a looking back at the past. People expressing their issues around working with government, what has worked, what hasn't worked. And so we're both assessing need and we're learning about innovative historic preservation practices that are coming from the grassroots, with the goal of developing an aggregate database through which we can develop something like a biennial report that educates the public on the true state of freedom colonies. Many people talk about African American towns or all Black towns, and freedom colonies encompass those, but a majority of freedom colonies are in places that have no planning infrastructure, and counties in Texas have no right to plan. And so what we're really trying to do is stand in the gap and make visible these places to policymakers and archaeologists, cultural resource managers, planners, designers, use the map so that before they even leave and go out and determine what's out there in the world, they already know that there are possible endangered or cultural resources, African American cultural resources that need to be protected. So that's what we do.
Thanks, Dr. Roberts. And I'm going to start to bring everyone back to the stage so we can talk about, so we can start to have a number of important conversations. And these will be the beginnings of conversations that we hope that all of you will have in your own communities and begin to join in all the spaces and places where they should happen. So we want to talk a little bit about how our history informs our past. We're going to talk about safe havens and what they've looked like in the past, what they need to look like today, how it feels to do this work. And we want to talk a bit about our future. To get started, let's maybe start to think about, what are some of the ways that care looks throughout history? And what are some of the practices that were centered in spiritual or cultural roots? And we also want to think about how family history impacts, informs, and informs communities and well-being of Black folks throughout the diaspora. So feel free to use, these questions as sort of a guide, but, I want to, give space, to Tamisha, who encouraged us to really tap into this topic, a bit more to start first. Like, what are some of the ways that history has informed our presence?
I would say that, sorry if there's an echo. I would say that most of the things we do are somehow informed by the past. There are things that are new, like certain technologies, but I think a lot of the things that we are coming back to are informed by things that we used to do. One example in particular, I think I'll use the example of like saging your house or cleaning in a certain way. So if you look at like New Year's Eve traditions of making sure that dirt is swept out the house so that, you can go into the new year with a fresh start. Or if you, cook, you have collard greens, black-eyed peas, and cornbread for what it symbolizes. And I think a lot of that is actually rooted in things that we do across the diaspora. So I lived in Ghana, I lived in Rwanda, I've been all over Africa and realized that pretty much wherever you go, there you are. And so, I realized that, hey, there's greens everywhere. It's just a different kind of green. It might not be collard, it might be cocoa yam leaves. And there's some kind of cornbread-like substance, some kind of grain, and then beans is the common thing. So for me, it was just a realization that we do carry those things in a lot of the things we do. And I think Dr. Roberts had some additional examples that she could bring up that we talked about before.
Yes, I think there are a number of practices that I've seen that are persistent, that help sustain evidence of community and place. And one of those is the manner in which African Americans sustain cemeteries. That is, during the Great Depression into the Great Migration, everyone was leaving these rural areas where you had African American cemeteries, and they were usually next to either churches that anchored larger communities. With the exodus of individuals into metropolitan areas for jobs, opportunity, and often for political asylum and safety from racial violence, with that exodus, you had this, still had a landscape that needed a steward with cemeteries in it. So how could you make people come back? Well, they invented the homecoming. So these annual homecomings are really ways that are customs that facilitated diasporic return to place and sustained the attachment to place, right? Through rituals, through church service, through singing, through food on the grounds. And all of those practices were really ways to cause people to mobilize people around a cause and to have a sustainable, financially sustainable and socially sustainable practice for proper stewardship of cemeteries. And so that's just one of the examples that we see all the way to the present for how we manage space, how we care for the dead, and how we sustain that connection.
I think another one of the examples that you all were discussing leading up to this event that struck me as one I just hadn't noticed just how consistent this particular practice had been throughout my life, but that sick and shut-in list that shows up in community centers and churches, that I honestly had not noted. I just thought it was the thing everybody did. Why wouldn't you? I remember asking my grandmother as a kid, like, what does it mean to be infirm? What's the sick and shut-in list? Where's Uncle George right now? And all of the answers to that question being about helping people within our community who needed attention, whether someone to stop by and pay a visit, or some additional resources to help them, manage their process of getting well. Have you all, really had experiences in your own life, whether with the Saging Your Home, sick and shut-in list, or some of these other topics that we've been talking about, Jordan or Marcus?
I think for me, it kind of asks a question. Another prompt here was history informs the present. But really what I think about with everything that's been mentioned is how much we can learn about the present from the past, and specifically through the lens of family history. Because I think all of this are traditions, the references that Dr. Roberts made about burial grounds and cemeteries kind of all tie back or tie into family history. And so I'm actually thinking about not necessarily the traditions. I think that's one reason why I'm so interested in family history, is finding the root or the source of some of the traditions that my family carries out, and learning what that ancestral passage was. Was it something through oral history? Is it something we do in order to uplift our ancestors, be it cooking a certain dish or meeting for certain holidays? I'm kind of resonating on that, on what exactly can we learn about the past, or about what we do in the present from the past, sorry. And I think there are a number of records that were mentioned. The sick and shut-in list is actually an interesting example, but it also makes me think about church programs. So like the weekly pamphlets that have a list of folks that might be on a prayer list, and examining that over time and seeing, okay, well, what was going on with so-and-so's life at that period of time, and how can we learn about that through oral history? So I think that there's much that we can also borrow, much that we can learn about what we do in the present by looking at it through family history.
Agreed. And we've talked about churches as a space, essentially, when we think about these sick and shut-in lists, to bring support to community, to be a part of community, but churches and other spaces have also been safe havens, So we want to, as people are constantly talking about safe spaces and what it means to create a safe space and to be in a safe space. How about we explore some of these questions about, what does it, and particularly like in your work, like what does it mean to preserve and support safe spaces or safe havens?
I'll jump in first if I could, Clinton. Um, I believe pretty much as I said before, well, that is the mission of my organization, Oklahoma Historical Society, is to collect, preserve, and then share that information with our public. As I said, like I know my learning, my research, the information I put out isn't the be all end all, but I don't know. As I said, I'm proud to do this work. As I had said, there's not much Black representation based on what we deem eligible in the lines of my work, but it is still important. Like I do understand, and when I talk to some of these people in the community, that it is, making a difference. It is giving some kind of relevance or pertinence back to these communities. Something, something to grasp onto, like once that they once had. So, it is work that I don't take lightly. It is just relevant.
Yeah, absolutely. I hear something's going on. Anybody want to sort of add to that, punctuate on that?
Yeah, I want to add that what makes it so powerful and relevant, the work that you do, Marcus, when we talk about safe spaces, is about sovereignty, and that these are places in which we first owned ourselves. And there's a certain safety and a need to protect havens in which we see ourselves reflected in each other and not necessarily validated or identity constructed based on whiteness. And so there's a certain safety to that psychically, to our psychic health, right? To our psychological health. And it is that has a ripple effect into other parts of health. And I just wanted to add, in thinking what we want to keep the community safe from, like what are we protecting them from? And I think the real dangers, or why I'm so committed to this work too, is we have environmental justice issues, we have ecological dangers, we have all of these ecological vulnerabilities that coexist or are co-located with our communities. And so to me, to make them true safe havens, we need to think about this, very holistically. We went to these places because that's where we could afford land, right? They're bottom land, it was near water source, and that was all that was left in some cases. But now we have to think more constructively about, well, what does that mean to live in this type of area? And what does sustainability mean in these places? So I think there's a more complicated idea about safe havens that we have to think through when we think about these places that we want to keep safe.
Yeah, absolutely. And Misha, you were always, there to keep us sort of focused on, in the spirit of why it was important that those spaces be safe, and what it means to make those spaces safe. How it feels to do this work, and I really want to spend some time exploring, how it feels to make sure that we are preserving spaces that people found safety in, and recreating spaces where people can find safe havens.
I'm actually gonna let Jordan Suggestion unmute his mic. I think he had something to say, but before I do that, I will say that for us and for me personally, it's probably one of the biggest honors of my life. One, to realize like how far and like how much we've done, even though it's like not always celebrated or not always recognized, that we have continued and do continue to seek out a way to preserve it or make it better or create ecosystems of care, if I want to say that. But I'll let Jordan chime in on what he wanted to say.
Thanks. So I was just going to comment on both Marcus's and Dr. Roberts' comments. So one, I think that representation was mentioned, and I think equity kind of goes alongside that when we're talking about safe spaces for communities and the preservation of said communities, where preservation shouldn't just look the way that I want preservation of a community to look, but really how that community wants its legacy to be told in terms of its story, but also how it wants it to look. And so I think that equity and representation is also needed. But to also comment on the current question on how this work makes me feel, if you think about the family historian in your family, and that might be the bearer of photos and oral history and all of this wealth of information, that person is probably incredibly proud of all of the information that they hold, and probably has an esteem of and power alongside holding all that information. And so I think those feelings and those responsibilities come along with it. And I think that also scales out to communities as well. So when you think about a community historian, that's someone who is often very esteemed, has a lot of pride in whatever it is whatever information they hold. And that's really how I feel. I think it's an incredible responsibility as well.
Agreed, absolutely. This work is just so important, and you know, when I want to say when I encountered Marcus in particular, the level of humility that he had in doing the work and sharing the work, all the while I'm thinking, if you didn't do this, you know, if this didn't happen, this information could have been lost. And having done this, how impactful it was to me, and how impactful it was to so many other people the people who showed it to me. This work is just so important, and I don't think that enough can be said about the work itself and the people who are doing it, the people who decide, despite how comfortable or uncomfortable it might feel in the spaces that you find yourself in, trying to do this work. Um, and very often in the context of GIS work, again, like we're going to find ourselves in spaces that may be entirely white except us, and people may not understand why it's important to do that. Why is it important to preserve space or to highlight safe havens? Why is that important, and why are you doing it that way? Like, why is that particular detail important? So when you all very with very much with entrepreneurial spirits decided to do what you were doing, did it occur to you how much, not just it would mean to you, but how much it would mean to others? And looking back 20, 30, 100 years from now, what it would look like, what it would feel like for folks in our future, being able to tap into the resources that you all are making available.
Yeah, I think almost immediately there was that realization of impact. And for Misha and I, it's been kind of a year in the making now. And I think increasingly that vision and that impact continues to scale. There's just, I think, so much that can be done in this work, and so many stories that can be told. And the effect of that is what we want to realize. So I'm inspired every day. I am challenged every day. But I think that kind of goes back to what I said. It's an incredible responsibility, but one that I think both of us want to see come to fruition.
How about you, Dr. Roberts? You're preserving, and every time we're talking, you're preserving for the folks today, for sure, descendants. But when you think about descendants, do you think about the descendants 200 years from now, and what they will have as a result of you being able to take advantage of GIS, the kind of technology, the kind of data collecting resources and data sharing resources that are available to folks today?
So I have two thoughts about that. One is, and I think we had discussed this, earlier, that I really think about or write about this concept called critical Sankofa. It's sort of, the concept of not being able to move forward before going back and learning from the past. But a critical Sankofa lens is one in which you are not only going through that practice, but you're even critical of the past. That is, we don't have a blind romanticism of the past. And so what I would hope 20, 30, 40, 50 years from now is that maturity, that evolution continues, that realism, so that we're able to be more selective about what we want to perpetuate right into the future. Those practices that we want to make part of our norm, and that are all those brilliant, practices and around cleaning and cleansing the air in our communities and in our homes, right? That Maisha was talking about earlier, the saging, all of those things. But at the same time, there's other practices we know that didn't always make everyone in our community feel welcome. And so I think about this mapping process that 30 years from now, there are people who are going to hopefully be able to deal with the double consciousness issue, right? Of how we simultaneously want to be seen, but we don't always want to be surveilled and watched. And so part of mapping is how to be strategically visible. And I'm hoping that technology helps us to be even more strategically visible instead of surveilled and controlled. So I think that's my hope, that I have 20, 30, 40 years from now, because that's what we grapple with now. Make these places visible so that you cannot as easily drive a freeway through them, that you have an accountability, a legal accountability process by virtue of making the place visible. But conversely, how do we keep that sovereignty, that protection, that sacred protection of our places? So those are the kind of things I'm hoping that we're, 30, 40, 50 years from now, more brilliant people are able to balance and resolve and deal with.
Some of the ways in which I believe that those folks, decades from now will benefit and be able to be more brilliant around the work that you're doing is, you're essentially empowering communities to share their stories and doing what you can to make sure that that those stories are theirs. And I really think that that's like the one of the major evolutions that we need to see happen in GIS and equity work at that intersection, that communities themselves own their data, that people feel like they can communicate and share their issues, their challenges, their joys, as comfortably as they share on social media, but with more ownership of their own information, and with it in a form that's more like data that can be analyzed later. And I think the surveys that you're sharing are making it easier for people to do that. And people will absolutely benefit from that in the future. And on this thread of future, let's move the conversation there. Let's talk about, what we need for the future and how we need to operate or continue to operate in the future, or how we may need to operate differently to support and enable safe spaces, healthy and well Black families and communities. Jordan, or can we go ahead?
I was going to add, just on the note of data and being able to, my hope, I guess, would be for people to be able to make informed decisions based on data, and for data to be used not just to, like, for us to use our data as leverage, because we know that that's like data's new oil, or whatever startup people say. But making sure that we can use that to say, no, this is the exact thing, this is the outcome I want for my community, and this is like what has happened. It had this effect, and like I can point that out with data, but saying, and then also like as practitioners of whatever we're doing, GIS, data, whatever, also think about how we might use that data differently, not to like profile or surveil people, but really to have better outcomes, not just for, whatever grant or whatever project we're on, but like for a society. So I think there's different ways that the data could be leveraged, or we might think about how we're using data, or what stories we're telling with the data.
Yeah, that definitely makes a lot of sense. And And again, GIS has these capabilities that let you today tell stories using story maps. You can crowdsource story, and we see a lot of those elements
Mhm.
in the work that you're doing with Kenkofa, the work that you're doing, Dr. Roberts. And in some ways, you can sort of bake in the configuration of that data to define a story that lasts and that where the structure lasts and yet it grows in terms of content. But I'm absolutely excited to see how in the same way that we look back at our past and we see the things that people who came before us did, we see them in a different light. We use the same facts to imagine a different story, to see the world that they lived in differently. I'm excited to see how people will see our world differently, and to be able to connect the this sort of data point that is the now with the data points that were previous states in the past, and and all of your work is enabling that. Um, so, there's a question here that's about ethics of care, and in terms of how we do the work and how we work. What are some things that we need to think about as we are doing this work to ensure that people um, feel protected, feel safe, and know that their stories are theirs?
I would say make sure that you're like in right relationship with the community that you're working in. So making sure that their lived experience in many ways outweighs your data, like in the, that's kind of controversial, but I would say their experiences are also kind of data that you might not have access to. So just because you've studied something doesn't mean that what you believe to be true is more valuable than what they have to offer because they've been living in this environment and doing it. They didn't study it, they lived it. So thinking about like how you reconcile both of those things, I think are very important.
Other thoughts?
Yeah, I would agree. I definitely believe that's a good point. In some of the surveys that I've done, we have more coming in the future towards some of these all black towns. But yeah, people really kind of just wanted to be able to connect and know. As we talked before, some of these communities have really just oral history historians who kind of safeguard this information, and even with myself being, of their culture, another black person, I mean, there are just safeguarded questions like, hey, what's your intent kind of necessarily with this? I mean, yes, we do have a rich history where I've heard the term, I believe it was like a sandbagger or almost like a quick reporter, if you will. I'm just going to take and soap up what I want real quick and leave. I believe that the people in the community, they really just wanted to know that, hey, you were really willing to listen. Like, we have this, but also, this story hasn't been necessarily told before. Like, are you willing to hear uh, other avenues, other things we may have to say, what other resources that we have? So, um, I believe uh, going forward with our communities, this information that we have, um, I guess what I'm trying to address is really like the intent of possibly say the collectee when we're going forward with this information. Are we authentic?
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely noticed that as I engage in conversations where my intent is to share information with a broader audience, depending on who's asking me the question, the level of detail shifts. Um, and I think and the level of detail, what detail, um, the care with which I tell the story, how much of the story I tell, that all sort of changes. And I think a part of what that is not just the realization that in the moment I am sharing a story, but that um, my share now becomes a data point that this person can use in the telling of stories that they want to tell. So being able to trust that the people who you're sharing information with um, will share stories going forward, using your info, your story, in a way that will will you know matter in a positive way to you, and in a way that will will help you and your community is really important. So Misha, to your point of being in good relationship with community, I think that's at so many different levels. And I think, Marcus, you were sort of touching on this, that in some ways, you know, your own individual past experiences matter in what you're going to share. And so we need to recognize that about individuals, but also the community story, the stories that are passed down to us that protect us and that inform us and help us to think about the consequences of trusting a person or an organization. Those matter as well. And when I think about the medical industry, I really feel like they need people like you all, who can get the trust of communities more easily, and can also make connections into those spaces and share that story in the way in which it needs to be shared to continue to grow that trust. Because how do we get to a point where people feel comfortable sharing their real lived experiences they encounter, spaces that are supposed to heal and make us better? How do we get to that point if we begin with such a long history of trust? I think it means we need a new set of people who look like you, perhaps you all, to stand in the gap, as someone mentioned earlier, and facilitate the growing of trust and the sharing of story.
I think it's also about valuing the people who are already doing the work, who don't necessarily have degrees, like Maisha was saying. You know, who are the cultural workers that are already doing this work? Yes, we're valuable because we're bridge builders and we stand in the gap, but there are people who have been doing this community building work, and I think specifically of kin keepers, right? Those people who keep the family Bible, who are usually, but not exclusively, women. And these are people who know who's married to whom. You know, they hold a different kind of sense of genetics, right? You know, who not to marry because they're too closely related. You know, when you go to a community event, and these are the women able to tell you that information. So I think it's about, you know, part of building the trust is valuing local knowledge. I think it's super, super important. And I spend so much time when I'm talking to my fellow academics about just that. And so I think part of the ethics of care is respect and honoring that local knowledge. And I think it's also about value, you know, expressing what you value and educating people about what their rights are when it comes to data and what they're releasing. Consent, you know, is huge, right? What are you consenting to? So I think that's a big part of what we need to do.
Absolutely. We have a question, by the way, from someone in the audience. They're asking Misha to elaborate a bit on what you mean by ecosystem of care.
So I made it up when I said it, but I can explain it more. How I think of it is, like we were talking about the sick and shut in list. I think about how that information was held at the church, but maybe a local root worker or a midwife or a doctor would be the person that, you know, provided that care, depending on like if it's semi-rural area. I think about who might have provided food if that person was sick and shut in. I think about how people might have pulled resources together. I think about, you know, and I'll use an example of when my great grandmother was sick, or when someone passes, and like how people bring out food, right? Like just an overabundance of food to make sure you eat for those 2 weeks. So it might not seem like a lot, but making sure there's food, making sure that someone is coordinating like cleaning supplies for you. I would think about transportation, just all those different kinds of like ecosystem things. It's not just like one person chipping in. It's what I have that I can offer. And it's not always something that we see in other communities. So I would call that an ecosystem of care.
Appreciate that, Misha.
You're welcome.
You know, as we close out and we move to wrapping here, I want to thank all of you for joining us today and being a part of this conversation. I want to thank our speakers in particular. I want to thank our what we call our North Star Constellation, our community of giving, impact, and influence, the folks who who help make it possible for us to deliver events like this. I definitely want to thank folks in the audience. And I want to give an opportunity for someone to close us out with a pretty strong message. I think, Misha, you just gave a great definition of what will be a new term that I think we'll all use, ecosystem of care. Dr. Roberts, maybe you can send us home with an important thought or an important question for folks to take back to their spaces.
How are you taking care of the caregivers? That to me is the question we need to ask, is how are we supporting those people who are caring for our stories, who are caring for our, hearts, our spirits? How are you caring for the caregivers, and how is your work manifesting that kind of care and honor of those people who are doing that work for us?
It's a really powerful question, and we thank you for it. Again, thanks all of you for joining us today. Thanks to our great speakers. We began some really important conversations here, or we continued some, because I think a lot of us are always talking about these things. And we hope that you will take these conversations with you in the future, bring them into the spaces that you exist, add to those questions, who's represented at the table, whether they be physically there or whether they be there in terms of the input from community. Take care, and we will see you at the next North Star event. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.